For 68 years, I celebrated every birthday with hope in my heart, believing that family was everything. I raised 3 children as a single mother after my husband died when they were young, pouring every ounce of love and every dollar I earned into giving them the best life possible. But this year, when my birthday came and went without so much as a phone call from any of them, I realized something that changed everything. They didn't forget my birthday. They simply didn't care enough to remember. That's when I made a decision that would shake their world to its core. I called my lawyer the very next morning and updated my will. What they didn't know was that I wasn't just some lonely old woman they could ignore. I was worth $4.2 million, and I had just decided they wouldn't see a penny of it. My name is Eleanor Matthews, and I spent my entire adult life believing that unconditional love meant giving without expecting anything in return. I was wrong, dead wrong, and it took turning 68 and being completely forgotten by my own children to finally see the truth. The story of how I got to this point begins long before that devastating birthday. It starts 36 years ago when my husband Robert died, suddenly of a heart attack at the age of 34, leaving me alone with 3 children under the age of 10. Sarah was 9, Michael was 7, and Jennifer was only 5. In that moment, standing in the hospital corridor while a doctor explained that there was nothing more they could do, I made a promise to myself and to Robert's memory that I would give these children everything they needed to succeed in life. What I didn't realize at the time was that I would literally give them everything. Not just my time, my energy, and my love, but my identity, my dreams, and ultimately, my sense of self-worth. I became so focused on being the perfect mother that I forgot to remain a complete person. In those early days after Robert's death, the grief was overwhelming, but I couldn't afford to fall apart. I had 3 small children depending on me, and Robert's life insurance barely covered the funeral expenses and outstanding debts. I had to figure out how to support a family on my own, with no college education and no real work experience beyond the part-time jobs I'd held before the children were born. I took a job as a waitress at a diner downtown, working the morning shifts so I could be home when the kids got out of school. The pay was terrible, but the tips helped, and the owner was understanding when one of the children got sick and I had to leave suddenly. In the evenings, after I'd helped with homework and gotten everyone fed and bathed and tucked into bed, I would sit at the kitchen table with accounting textbooks I'd borrowed from the library, teaching myself bookkeeping so I could eventually get a better job. It took me 4 years of studying every night after the children went to sleep, but I finally got my certification and landed a position as a bookkeeper for a small manufacturing company. The pay was better and the hours were more regular, but it still wasn't enough to provide the kind of life I wanted for my children. So I took on freelance bookkeeping clients on weekends, working while the kids watched Saturday morning cartoons or played in the backyard. Every decision I made was filtered through one question: what's best for the children? When my car broke down, I bought the cheapest used car I could find, so there would be more money for school clothes. When the roof started leaking, I learned to patch it myself instead of hiring a contractor. When Sarah expressed interest in piano lessons, I worked extra weekend clients for 3 months to pay for them. When Michael wanted to play Little League, I took on another freelance account to cover the equipment and fees. When Jennifer needed glasses, I went without dental work for 2 years to afford them. I told myself this was what good mothers did. Good mothers sacrificed. Good mothers put their children's needs first. Good mothers worked themselves to the bone to ensure their children had opportunities they never had. And in many ways, I was right. My children did have opportunities. They had music lessons and sports teams and educational trips. They had college funds that I built penny by penny, even when it meant eating ramen noodles for dinner 3 nights a week. But somewhere along the way, something fundamental shifted in our family dynamic. The children stopped seeing my sacrifices as gifts and started seeing them as entitlements. They stopped being grateful for the piano lessons and started expecting them. They stopped appreciating the college funds and started planning how to spend them. They stopped seeing me as a person who was choosing to give and started seeing me as a resource that existed solely for their benefit. I noticed it first when Sarah was in high school. She'd become interested in studying abroad during college, which was an expensive proposition. When I told her I'd need to take out a second mortgage on the house to make it happen, she didn't thank me or express any concern about the financial burden I'd be taking on. Instead, she immediately started researching programs and making plans, as if my willingness to go into debt for her dreams was simply a given. The pattern continued with Michael. When he graduated from college with a degree in construction management, he announced he wanted to start his own business. He needed startup capital, and he looked to me expectantly. When I gave him my entire life savings $15,000 I'd been slowly accumulating for my own retirement, he accepted it as if it was his due, not a massive sacrifice on my part. Jennifer's wedding was perhaps the most telling example. She'd always dreamed of a big, elaborate celebration, and I wanted to give that to her. I spent 2 years saving every extra penny, taking on additional clients, and even selling some of my mother's jewelry to pay for the kind of wedding she envisioned. The final cost was nearly $30,000 more than I made in an entire year. Throughout the planning process, Jennifer would call me with updates about flowers and catering and music, but she never once acknowledged the financial sacrifice I was making. To her, it seemed, paying for her wedding was simply what mothers did. The most heartbreaking part wasn't the money itself. I genuinely wanted to provide these things for my children. The heartbreaking part was their complete lack of awareness or appreciation for what these gifts cost me. They had no idea that their piano lessons meant I ate peanut butter sandwiches for lunch every day for 6 months. They didn't know that their college funds meant I drove a car with a broken air conditioner for 3 summers because I couldn't afford to fix it. They never realized that their wedding and business startup and study abroad program meant I had no retirement savings, no emergency fund, no financial security of my own. More importantly, they seemed to have no curiosity about my life beyond my role as their provider. They never asked about my work, my interests, my hopes, or my feelings. They called when they needed something: advice, money, babysitting, emotional support, but they rarely called just to check on me. When they did visit, the conversations centered around their lives, their problems, their successes, their plans. I became a supporting character in their stories rather than the protagonist of my own. This dynamic continued as they became adults and started their own families. Sarah built a successful career in pharmaceutical marketing, eventually earning more in a year than I'd ever made in my entire life. But despite her financial success, she still turned to me when she needed help. Not money now, but time and emotional labor. She'd call when she was stressed about work, expecting me to listen and offer advice. She'd ask me to house sit when she traveled, watch her neighbors' pets when they went out of town, help her organize her home office when she was overwhelmed. Michael's construction business eventually became quite successful, employing a dozen people and taking on major commercial projects. But he still called me regularly to discuss business decisions, to ask my opinion on personnel issues, to vent about difficult clients. He valued my input and my support, but he never seemed to consider that I might have my own concerns or challenges that could benefit from discussion. Jennifer, as a teacher and mother, was the most demanding of my time and energy. She called almost daily, usually with questions about parenting, requests for babysitting, or updates about her children's activities that she assumed I'd want to hear in great detail. She'd invite me to Emma and Noah's school events and sports games, which I loved attending, but she never thought to ask if I had other commitments or interests that might conflict. The children's father, Robert, had been gone for so long that they had no memory of me as anything other than their mother. They'd never seen me as a wife, a romantic partner, a woman with desires and dreams independent of my role in their lives. They'd never seen me pursue my own interests or maintain my own friendships or prioritize my own needs. To them, I was a mother-shaped person who existed solely to serve their family unit. As the years passed, I found myself becoming increasingly isolated. I'd lost touch with most of my friends during those early years when I was working multiple jobs and raising 3 children alone. I'd never pursued hobbies or interests because there was no time or money for such luxuries. I'd never dated or remarried because I convinced myself that my children needed all of my attention and energy. I'd built my entire identity around being their mother, and now that they were adults with their own families, I wasn't sure who I was supposed to be. It started 3 weeks before my 68th birthday. I had been dropping hints to my children about the approaching date. Nothing too obvious, just casual mentions during our phone calls. Well, my phone calls to them anyway, since they rarely called me first anymore. I'd mentioned how spring birthdays were always lovely, or how I was looking forward to celebrating another year, or how it seemed like just yesterday that I was turning 67. During one conversation with Sarah, I mentioned how spring birthdays were always so lovely, hoping she might make the connection. She responded with distracted agreement while I could hear her typing in the background, probably working on her laptop while barely listening to me. She cut the call short for a conference call, which was typical Sarah. Always busy, always important, always somewhere else mentally even when she was talking to you. She worked as a marketing executive for a major pharmaceutical company, made 6 figures, and lived in a downtown penthouse that cost more per month than I used to make in a year. She'd inherited her father's drive and ambition, but somewhere along the way, She'd also inherited an inability to prioritize relationships over career advancement. I tried a different approach with Michael. He was my middle child, 39 years old, and running his own construction business. He'd always been the most sentimental of the three, the one who remembered Mother's Day and called just to chat about nothing in particular. If anyone would remember, it would be Michael. During our next conversation, I brought up memories of wonderful birthday celebrations from the past, hoping to trigger his memory about the upcoming date. But when I mentioned the wonderful birthday party he'd thrown for me when he turned 30, he seemed distant and distracted, claiming he was at a job site and would call back later. Later never came. It never did any more with any of them. Jennifer was my youngest at 35, and she'd always been my baby. She was a teacher, married to a decent man named David, and they had 2 children, my only grandchildren. Emma was 12 and Noah was 9, and they were the light of my life. If I was being honest, they were the only reason I still felt like I had a family at all. When I mentioned that my birthday was coming up and suggested we all get together for dinner, she gave me that familiar note of vague agreement that never actually led to concrete plans. Things were always too crazy with the kids' schedules and David's work travel, but we'd definitely figure something out. Figure something out. The phrase that meant we'll think about it until it's too late and then feel guilty. As my birthday approached, I found myself making all the same preparations I'd been making for years. I bought myself a small cake from the bakery down the street, chocolate with vanilla frosting, because that's what my late husband Robert used to request every year. I picked up some flowers for the dining room table and made sure I had enough food in case anyone decided to drop by unexpectedly. I even bought ingredients to make Robert's favorite dinner, pot roast with carrots and potatoes, thinking maybe one of the children would want to come over for a home-cooked meal. The day before my birthday, I called all 3 of them again, one last attempt to see if anyone would remember. Sarah's phone went straight to voicemail with her businesslike message about returning calls within 24 to 48 hours. The irony wasn't lost on me that my own daughter couldn't be bothered to answer my call, but expected other people to wait up to 2 days for her to return theirs. Michael picked up but was clearly driving, heading to pick up supplies for a job. When I asked what everyone was up to tomorrow, he seemed genuinely confused about why Tuesday would be anything special. He rattled off his schedule appointments with suppliers, a site inspection, paperwork to catch up on, but there was no recognition in his voice that tomorrow might be significant for any other reason. Jennifer answered amid the chaos of children in the background. I could hear Emma practicing piano and Noah arguing with someone about homework. When I asked about her plans for tomorrow, she mentally went through her scheduled parent-teacher conferences at 3, Noah's soccer practice at 5, grocery shopping after that, the usual Tuesday routine. She spoke with the efficiency of someone managing a busy household, but there was no pause, no moment of realization, no sudden recognition of what she might be forgetting. I hung up each call feeling a little more invisible, a little more forgotten. These were the children I'd sacrificed everything for. These were the people I'd worked 2 jobs to support, stayed up all night nursing through illnesses, attended every school play and soccer game and graduation ceremony for. I'd been 32 when Robert died of a heart attack, leaving me with 3 kids under 10 and a mountain of debt. I could have remarried. There were opportunities, men who showed interest, who would have provided financial security and companionship, but I chose to focus entirely on being their mother. I put myself through night school to become a bookkeeper while working days at a diner. I saved every penny I could so they could go to college without student loans. I drove a 15-year-old car so they could have decent clothes and school supplies. I shopped at thrift stores for myself so they could shop at regular stores. I cut my own hair so they could go to proper salons. I wore the same winter coat for 12 years so they could have new ones when they outgrew theirs. When Sarah wanted to study abroad her junior year, I took out a loan against my house to pay for it. When she called me crying from London because she was homesick and overwhelmed, I talked her through it, reminding her how hard I'd worked to make that opportunity possible and encouraging her to stick with it. When she came home with stories and photos and experiences that had broadened her perspective and enriched her life, I felt proud and satisfied that my sacrifice had been worthwhile. When Michael's construction business needed startup capital, I gave him my entire savings account, $15,000, that represented years of careful saving and financial discipline. When his business struggled in the first year and he needed additional help with equipment costs, I took on extra freelance clients and gave him another $5,000. When he finally started turning a profit and hired his first employee, I felt validated that my investment in his dream had paid off. When Jennifer got married, I spent 2 years planning and paying for a wedding that cost more than I'd ever spent on myself in my entire life. I researched vendors, compared prices, negotiated contracts, and coordinated details. I wanted her to have the fairy tale wedding she'd dreamed of since she was a little girl. When she walked down the aisle in a dress that cost more than my monthly salary, looking radiant and happy, I felt like every sacrifice had been worth it. And now, they couldn't even remember the day I was born. My birthday dawned bright and sunny, the kind of perfect spring day that should have felt full of promise and possibility. I woke up at 6:30, the same time I'd been waking up for the past 40 years, long before I needed to for any particular reason. It was a habit formed in those early years when I had to get up before the children to prepare for the day ahead. I made my coffee, read the newspaper, and waited. At 8 o'clock, I thought maybe they were waiting until after work to call. Sarah was often in meetings during the morning hours, and it would be like her to plan to call during her lunch break or on her way home from the office. At noon, I convinced myself they might be planning a surprise dinner. Maybe they were coordinating with each other, trying to clear their schedules, arranging for babysitters for Emma and Noah. Maybe Jennifer was cooking something special, or Michael was picking up a cake, or Sarah was driving in from the city. At 3 o'clock, I started checking my phone every 5 minutes to make sure it was working. I called my own voicemail to confirm that people could leave messages. I sent myself a text to verify that messages were coming through. Everything was working perfectly. The silence wasn't due to technical difficulties. At 6 o'clock, I ate dinner alone with my store-bought cake, staring at my silent phone. I'd made Robert's favorite pot roast, set the table for 4 in case anyone showed up unexpectedly, and lit the candles we used to use for special occasions. I sat in the dining room where we'd celebrated countless birthdays and holidays and milestones, surrounded by empty chairs and the echo of memories from when my children were young, and I was the center of their world. At 9 o'clock, I called Jennifer. Maybe something was wrong. Maybe someone was sick. Maybe there was a family emergency that had caused everyone to forget. She answered cheerfully, getting the kids ready for bed, and seemed genuinely happy to talk. The normalcy of her tone told me immediately that nothing was wrong, which somehow made everything worse. When Noah got on the phone to tell me about scoring 2 goals at soccer practice, my heart broke and swelled at the same time. At least someone was happy to talk to me. His excitement was genuine and infectious, and for those few minutes, I forgot about my disappointment and just enjoyed my grandson's joy. But when Jennifer took the phone back and casually said she'd talk to me tomorrow, treating it like any other day, the reality hit me like a physical blow. Not one of them had remembered, not one. That night, I did something I'd never done before. I opened a bottle of expensive wine that I'd been saving for a special occasion, and I got drunk. Not tipsy, not pleasantly buzzed, but properly, thoroughly drunk. I sat at my kitchen table with Robert's old photo in front of me and had a conversation with my dead husband about how our children had forgotten I existed. If he'd been there, he probably would have made excuses for them. Robert always saw the best in everyone, especially his kids. He would have said they were busy, that they had their own lives, that forgetting a birthday didn't mean they didn't love me. He would have reminded me of all the good times, all the ways they'd shown their love over the years, all the reasons to give them the benefit of the doubt. But Robert wasn't there. He'd been gone for 36 years, and I'd spent every single one of those years trying to be both mother and father to our children. I'd been the disciplinarian and the nurturer, the provider and the comforter, the cheerleader and the homework helper. I'd been everything to them, and in the process, I'd become nothing to myself. And they'd grown up and forgotten I existed. Somewhere between my 3rd and 4th glass of wine, I made a decision that would change everything. I walked to my home office, sat down at my computer, and opened my email. I typed a message to Harold Zimmerman, the lawyer who'd been handling my affairs for the past 15 years. Harold was 74 years old, semi-retired, and had been Robert's college roommate before becoming our family lawyer. He'd drawn up my original will when the kids were still teenagers, and he'd known them their entire lives. "Harold, I need to make some changes to my will. Can we meet this week? It's urgent." Eleanor. I sent the email at 11:47 p.m. on my 68th birthday, then sat back and stared at the screen. What I had just set in motion would either wake my children up to what they were losing, or it would be the final confirmation that I had failed as a mother in ways I was only beginning to understand. Harold called me first thing the next morning, his voice full of concern. He asked if I was feeling all right, if I was sick, what was prompting this sudden urgency about my will. When I told him about my birthday, about the phone calls and the silence and the growing realization that my children saw me as an obligation rather than a person they actually wanted in their lives, he listened without interruption, which was one of the things I'd always appreciated about him. When I finished my story, Harold was quiet for a long moment. Then he gently suggested that maybe I was overreacting, that people forget things, that it didn't necessarily mean they didn't love me. I asked him when was the last time he'd forgotten his wife's birthday. There was another pause. I asked when was the last time he'd forgotten his children's birthdays. He admitted he saw where I was going with this. I explained that my children didn't forget my birthday, they never bothered to remember it in the first place. There was a difference between forgetting something important and never considering it important enough to remember. We scheduled a meeting for the following afternoon. That morning, I did something else I'd never done before. I went through every interaction I'd had with my children over the past year and wrote them down. Phone calls, visits, text messages, emails, everything. I wanted to see if my perception of our relationship was accurate or if I was being overly emotional and unfair. The results were illuminating and devastating. In 12 months, Sarah had called me exactly 6 times. 4 of those calls were to ask me to house sit while she traveled for work, since she knew I was always home anyway, and could be trusted with her expensive downtown condo. One call was to ask if I still had her high school yearbooks because she wanted to show them to a coworker who'd gone to the same school. The last call was to tell me she was too busy to make it to my cousin Margaret's funeral, but could I pass along her condolences to the family? Michael had called me 11 times, which seemed better until I analyzed the content of those calls. 8 of them were to ask for advice about his business problems, personnel issues, client complaints, equipment decisions, cash flow concerns. He valued my input and experience, but he treated me more like a business consultant than a mother. The other 3 calls were genuine check-ins, but they lasted an average of 4 minutes each and consisted mainly of him telling me how busy he was. Jennifer was the most frequent caller at twice a month, but our conversations were almost entirely about the children's schedules, school events, and her need for childcare assistance. She'd call to ask if I could pick up Emma from dance class, attend Noah's soccer games when she couldn't make it, help with science fair projects, or babysit when she and David wanted to go out. She called me when she needed something, not because she wanted to talk to me. When was the last time any of them had asked how I was feeling? When was the last time they'd asked about my life, my interests, my thoughts about anything unrelated to their immediate needs? I couldn't remember. I'd become a service provider in their lives, not a mother, not a person. The meeting with Harold went exactly as I'd expected. He tried to talk me out of it, suggested I was being hasty, recommended family counseling. He reminded me that inheritance decisions made in anger often led to regret later on. But I'd made up my mind, and my decision wasn't based on anger, it was based on clarity. I wasn't doing this out of spite, I explained to Harold. I was doing this because I finally understood something fundamental about love. Real love is reciprocal. It's not about keeping score, but it's also not about one person giving everything while the other person takes it for granted. Love requires attention, effort, and mutual consideration. It requires seeing the other person as a complete human being, not just as a role they play in your life. I handed him a list I'd written the night before with the changes I wanted to make. Harold put on his reading glasses and scanned the document. His eyebrows rose higher and higher as he read. When he finished, he looked up at me with an expression that was part concern, part admiration. "Eleanor, this is substantial. Are you absolutely certain?" "I've never been more certain of anything in my life." The changes were indeed substantial. My estate, which was worth approximately $4.2 million, after a lifetime of careful saving and smart investing, had previously been divided equally among my 3 children. The money had accumulated slowly over decades of frugal living and wise financial decisions. I'd invested Robert's life insurance payout conservatively but consistently. I'd saved portions of every paycheck, even when money was tight. I'd bought our house for $28,000 in 1987 and watched it appreciate to nearly $400,000. I'd never lived extravagantly, never taken expensive vacations, never bought luxury items for myself. Every financial decision had been made with my children's future in mind. Now, that future would look very different. 75% of my estate would go to charity specifically, to organizations that supported single mothers, provided scholarships for first-generation college students, and helped elderly people who'd been abandoned by their families. These were causes close to my heart, organizations that helped people in situations similar to what I'd experienced throughout my life. 20% would go to my grandchildren, Emma and Noah, in trust funds that they could access when they turned 25. This money would be earmarked for education, starting their own families or other major life goals. I wanted to ensure that my grandchildren had opportunities, but I also wanted them to be old enough to appreciate the gift and understand its significance. The remaining 5% would be divided among my 3 children, provided they met certain conditions that would be spelled out in a letter I planned to write. This letter would be sealed and only opened after my death, explaining the reasoning behind my decisions and outlining what they would need to do to claim their small portion of the inheritance. Harold asked what kind of conditions I had in mind. I told him they'd find out when I was gone, but it involved them proving they actually remembered I existed as a person, not just as their mother. The conditions would require them to demonstrate that they'd learned something about love, attention, and reciprocal relationships. Harold asked one more time if I wanted to talk to them first, give them a chance to explain or make amends. I told him about sitting by the phone all day on my birthday waiting for one of them to call. I explained that I would have been happy with a text message, a Facebook post, even a card sent a day late. But I got absolutely nothing. And then Jennifer called me that evening completely oblivious, chatting about soccer practice and homework like it was any other day. It wasn't malicious, Harold, I said. It wasn't even thoughtless. It was worse than that. It was indifferent. We spent the next 2 hours going through every detail of the new will. Harold, being a good lawyer, played devil's advocate and forced me to think through every possible scenario and consequence. What if one of the children got seriously ill and needed expensive medical care? What if one of them lost their job and couldn't support their family? What if they genuinely tried to make amends, but it was too late? My resolve never wavered. I'd spent 36 years being their safety net, their backup plan, their source of unconditional support. It was time for them to learn to create safety nets for themselves. It was time for them to understand that relationships require maintenance, that love requires effort, that taking people for granted has consequences. When we finished, Harold leaned back in his chair and studied me with an expression I'd never seen before. You know, Eleanor, in 40 years of practicing law, I've seen a lot of family drama. Most of it stems from money and inheritance disputes, but I've never seen anyone use an inheritance to teach a lesson about love. Maybe that's because most people don't live long enough to realize they need to teach that lesson, I replied. Maybe. Or maybe most people are afraid of the consequences. Harold, I'm 68 years old. My husband has been dead for 36 years. I've spent my entire adult life putting other people's needs before my own. What exactly am I supposed to be afraid of? He smiled for the first time since I'd walked into his office. You know what, Eleanor? I think you might be the bravest client I've ever had. 2 weeks later, Harold called to tell me the new will was ready for signing. I drove to his office on a Thursday morning, signed all the documents with a steady hand, and walked out feeling lighter than I had in years. But changing my will was only the first step. The second step was changing my life. I'd spent so many years waiting for my phone to ring, hoping my children would visit, making myself available for whatever they might need, that I'd forgotten how to live for myself. I'd become a person whose entire existence revolved around other people's schedules, other people's needs, other people's priorities. Now, for the first time since Robert died, I was going to figure out what I actually wanted to do with my time. The first thing I did was call my old friend Margaret. We'd known each other since high school, but had drifted apart over the years as we got busy with our families. She'd been widowed around the same time as me, but unlike me, she'd remarried 10 years later to a wonderful man named Frank. I'd always felt a little jealous of her second chance at happiness, but I'd been too focused on my children to pursue anything similar for myself. Margaret was delighted to hear from me, and when I told her about my birthday, about the will, about my decision to start living for myself, she was thrilled. She'd always thought I was too responsible, too tied down, always worried about what my kids might need. When she mentioned that she and Frank were planning a trip to Europe that fall and wished I was the type of person who would just pack up and come with them, I surprised her by saying I was thinking about becoming a different type of person. 3 months later, I found myself sitting in a cafe in Rome, eating gelato for breakfast and laughing with Margaret and Frank about absolutely nothing important. It was the first time I'd left the country since my honeymoon with Robert 45 years earlier. I'd never traveled internationally because there was always something more important to spend the money on the children's education, their activities, their needs. Now, at 68, I was finally seeing the world I'd dreamed about as a young woman. My children, meanwhile, had barely noticed I was gone. I'd told them I was traveling, of course. I wasn't trying to punish them by disappearing without notice, but their reactions were telling in their casual indifference. Sarah's response was typical. "That's great, Mom. You deserve a vacation. Have fun." She said it with the same tone she might use to comment on a neighbor's weekend plans, cheerful, but completely unengaged. Michael's response was equally superficial. "Cool, Mom. Take lots of pictures." He seemed to view my trip as a nice hobby for an elderly person, something to keep me busy and entertained. Jennifer's response was perhaps the most revealing. How fun. The kids will want to hear all about it when you get back. Even my international travel was filtered through the lens of how it might benefit her children. No one asked where I was going, who I was traveling with, or how long I'd be gone. No one seemed curious about this completely out-of-character decision to leave the country. No one asked if I was nervous about flying internationally for the first time in decades, or if I needed help with travel arrangements, or if I was concerned about being so far from home at my age. They were happy for me in the abstract, the way you're happy for a distant acquaintance who announces some good news on social media. While I was in Rome, standing in front of the Trevi Fountain and making a wish for my new life, my phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer. The message was cheerful and casual. Hi, Mom. Hope you're having fun. Can you call when you get a chance? Need to ask you something. I called her from my hotel room that evening, looking out at the illuminated Colosseum, while she asked if there was any chance I could watch Emma and Noah because David's mom was having surgery and they needed to go to Phoenix to help. She seemed genuinely surprised when I reminded her I was in Italy and wouldn't be back for another 10 days, as if she'd somehow forgotten that I'd mentioned international travel. When she pressed me to help once I got back, explaining they were really in a bind and couldn't find anyone else to provide overnight childcare, I said something I'd never said before. I'm sorry, Jennifer, but I can't. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. You can't? She repeated as if she'd never heard those words from me before. No, I can't. You'll need to make other arrangements. What kind of plans could you possibly have that are more important than helping with your grandchildren? The question revealed everything I needed to know about how she viewed me and my life. In her mind, I couldn't possibly have plans, commitments, or interests that would take priority over her family's needs. I was a resource that should always be available when required. The kind of plans that matter to me, I said calmly. When she called me selfish for not cutting short my first international trip in 45 years to provide free childcare while she helped her husband's family, I realized how deeply ingrained their expectations had become. I asked her when was the last time she'd changed her plans to accommodate something I wanted to do. She said it was different because I was her mother, as if being a mother meant automatically surrendering any right to prioritize my own needs and desires. I told her that mothers are people too, with their own lives and needs and dreams. I hung up before she could respond, then sat in my Roman hotel room and felt proud of myself for the first time in years. The rest of my trip was wonderful. I toured the Vatican, marveling at the Sistine Chapel and thinking about art and beauty and the human capacity for creation. I took a cooking class in Tuscany, learning to make fresh pasta from an elderly Italian woman who reminded me of my grandmother. I spent an entire day at the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, looking at Renaissance masterpieces and thinking about time and mortality and what it meant to create something lasting. Most importantly, I had conversations with strangers. I talked to other travelers at cafes and museums, sharing stories and observations about the places we were visiting. I realized how long it had been since I'd had conversations with people who knew nothing about my role as a mother, grandmother, or family caretaker. To these people, I was just Eleanor, a woman traveling through Italy, interested in art and history and culture. They saw me as a complete person, not just as someone's relative. When I returned home, there were 17 missed calls from my children. I could see from the timestamps that they'd started calling the day after my conversation with Jennifer, probably after she'd told them about my refusal to cut my trip short. The frequency of the calls increased as the days passed, suggesting growing panic on their part. I didn't return any of them for 3 days. Not out of spite, but because I needed time to process what I'd experienced and decide how I wanted to move forward. I tasted independence and self-determination for the first time in decades, and I wasn't ready to immediately fall back into my old patterns. When I finally called Jennifer back, she was a different person. The panic and concern in her voice were immediately apparent, and for the first time in years, she seemed to be thinking about me as a person rather than just as a resource. She apologized immediately, saying she was completely out of line, calling me selfish. She and David had figured out the childcare situation, and everything had worked out fine. But more importantly, she said, she'd realized something during those 3 days of not being able to reach me. She couldn't remember the last time I said no to any of them about anything, and that wasn't normal or healthy. I think I've been taking advantage of you for a long time without even realizing it, she admitted. When you didn't answer your phone for 3 days, I started to panic. Not just about the babysitting situation, but about you. I realized that I had no idea if you were okay, if you were happy, if you needed anything. I only ever called when I needed something from you. It was the first honest conversation we'd had in years, and it gave me hope that maybe, just maybe, things could change. Over the next few months, I continued to make changes in my life. I joined a book club at the local library, something I had always wanted to do but never had time for, when I was constantly available for family emergencies and requests. The book club met twice a month to discuss literary fiction, and I discovered that I had opinions about books, insights about characters and themes that other people found interesting and valuable. I started taking piano lessons, something I'd dreamed of doing since I was a child, but had never been able to afford. My teacher was a patient woman in her 40s who treated me like any other student, not like someone's elderly mother trying to stay busy. I practiced every day, slowly working through beginner pieces and feeling proud of each small milestone. I began volunteering at a local literacy center, teaching adults how to read. Many of my students were immigrants, single mothers, people who dropped out of school young and were now trying to improve their lives. Working with them reminded me of my own struggles as a young widow, and I felt useful in a way that had nothing to do with my children's needs. I even went on a few dates with a lovely man named George, whom I met at the book club. George was a retired teacher, widowed for 5 years, and he was interested in me as Eleanor, not as someone's mother or grandmother. We had dinner at nice restaurants, went to movies, attended lectures at the local college. For the first time since Robert died, I remembered what it felt like to be seen as a woman, not just as a caregiver. My children's reactions to these changes were mixed and revealing. Sarah seemed vaguely approving but disinterested. "Good for you, Mom." "It sounds like you're keeping busy," she said when I mentioned my new activities. She spoke as if my piano lessons and book club were equivalent to taking up crossword puzzles or watching more television, just ways for an elderly person to fill time. She didn't ask about what books we were reading, what pieces I was learning to play, or whether I was enjoying these new experiences. Michael was more engaged, but in a way that revealed his limited understanding of who I was as a person. He asked questions about my piano lessons and even came over one evening to hear me play a simple piece I'd learned. "I never knew you were musical, Mom," he said, which made me sad because there were so many things about me he'd never bothered to learn. He seemed surprised that I had interests and talents beyond those directly related to serving his family. Jennifer was the most affected by the changes, probably because she'd always relied on me the most heavily. She started calling me more often not to ask for favors, but just to talk. She asked about my book club, my volunteer work, my piano progress. She even asked if I wanted to have lunch, just the two of us, no kids, which was something we'd never done before. During that lunch at a restaurant downtown, Jennifer admitted something that broke my heart and gave me hope at the same time. "I feel like I don't really know you," she said. "I know you as my mom and the kids' grandmother, but I don't know you as Eleanor. I don't know what you think about politics or what kind of books you like or what makes you laugh. I've been so focused on what you could do for me that I never thought about who you actually are." When I asked what she'd like to know, she said, "Everything. What do you think about when you're alone? What do you dream about? What makes you happy besides us?" It was the first time in years that one of my children had asked me a question about myself that wasn't related to my availability or willingness to help with something. We talked for 3 hours that day, and Jennifer learned things about me that surprised her. She didn't know that I'd always wanted to travel but had never been able to afford it. She didn't know that I'd been interested in art history since college but had never pursued it. She didn't know that I sometimes felt lonely in my big house, or that I worried about what would happen to me when I got old and frail, or that I sometimes wondered what my life would have been like if I'd made different choices after Robert died. "Why didn't you ever tell us any of this?" she asked. "Because you never asked," I said simply, and because I convinced myself that being a good mother meant never having needs of my own. 6 months after my birthday, Jennifer remembered Mother's Day. Not only did she remember it, but she planned something special that showed she'd been listening to our conversations. She arranged for Emma and Noah to spend the day with David's parents, and she took me to a spa for massages and facials. She explained that she wanted to do something just for me, not something family-oriented or kid-friendly. It was lovely, but it was also telling. She felt the need to explicitly exclude her own children from a day dedicated to celebrating motherhood. She understood finally that being a mother didn't mean I had to completely disappear as an individual. Over dinner that evening, Jennifer asked me a question that caught me off guard. "Mom, do you ever regret having kids?" I considered the question carefully before answering. "I don't regret having you and your brothers. You three are the best thing I ever did. But I do regret losing myself in the process. What do you mean? I mean, I spent so many years defining myself solely as your mother that I forgot I was also a person with my own interests and desires and dreams. And I let you forget that too. We never asked you to do that. No, you didn't, but you accepted it without question. And when I started to reclaim parts of myself, you resisted. Jennifer nodded thoughtfully. You're right. I did resist. I think I was scared that if you had your own life, you wouldn't need us anymore. And if you didn't need us, maybe you wouldn't love us anymore. Oh, honey, I said, reaching across the table to take her hand. That's exactly backwards. I'm not learning to love you less. I'm learning to love myself more, and that makes me a better mother, not a worse one. By the time my 69th birthday came around, things had changed dramatically. Sarah called me 2 weeks in advance to ask what I wanted to do to celebrate. Michael started planning a family dinner and asked me where I'd like to go. Jennifer suggested we make it a weekend celebration and asked if I wanted to invite any of my new friends from the book club. For the first time in years, I felt like they actually wanted to celebrate me, not just fulfill an obligation. But there was still something they didn't know. They didn't know about the will. Harold had been checking in with me every few months, always asking the same question. Are you sure about this, Eleanor? You could always change it back. I'm sure, Harold. More sure every day. Even though things seem to be improving with your children? Especially because things are improving. They are improving because I changed, not because they did. They're responding to my new boundaries, my new expectations, my new willingness to prioritize myself. That's good, but it's also conditional. What happens when I get old and sick and need them instead of them needing me? What happens when I'm no longer useful as a babysitter or advisor or emotional support system? You don't know that they would abandon you. You're right, I don't know. But I know that for 68 years, they only knew how to take from me. Learning how to give back is going to take practice, and my will is going to be their final exam. On my 69th birthday, all three of my children were present for dinner. Sarah flew in from Chicago, taking time off work for the first time in years to attend a family event. Michael brought flowers, not the generic grocery store bouquet he usually grabbed at the last minute, but a carefully chosen arrangement from a real florist. Jennifer made a photo album of family memories that actually included pictures of me, not just pictures of them as children, but photos of me at different stages of my life, including some recent ones from my trip to Italy. It was a lovely evening, and I enjoyed every minute of it. But I also noticed things. Sarah still checked her phone regularly throughout dinner, though she tried to be subtle about it. Michael's conversation still centered mainly around his work and his problems, though he did ask about my piano progress. Jennifer was the most present and engaged, asking thoughtful questions about my book club and my volunteer work. They were trying, which I appreciated, but they were still learning how to see me as a complete person rather than just in relation to themselves. After dinner, Emma asked me to help her with a school project about family history. She wanted to interview me about my childhood, my parents, my life, before I became their grandmother. It was the first time anyone in the family had shown interest in my personal history. Tell me about when you were my age, Grandma, she said, pulling out a notebook. What did you want to be when you grew up? Well, I wanted to be a teacher, I said. I loved learning, and I loved the idea of helping other people learn. Why didn't you become a teacher? I got married young and started having babies. In those days, it was harder for women to have both careers and families. That's sad, Emma said with the clarity that only children possess. You would have been a good teacher. How do you know? Because you taught my mom how to be a good mom, and you taught Uncle Michael how to build things, and you taught Aunt Sarah how to be smart about money. You teach people all the time. Out of the mouths of babes. That night, after everyone had gone home, I sat in my living room with a cup of tea and thought about Emma's words. I had been a teacher, in a way. I taught my children everything they knew about work ethic, about resilience, about love. I'd taught them by example how to sacrifice for the people you care about, but I'd failed to teach them one crucial lesson: how to recognize when someone is sacrificing for you and how to be grateful for it. Maybe it wasn't too late. 2 years passed. My relationship with my children continued to evolve in positive ways, but slowly. Sarah made an effort to call more often, but she still dominated our conversations with talk about her job and her stress levels. She seemed to view our relationship as a form of therapy for her, where she could unload her problems and receive encouragement and advice. She rarely asked about my life or problems. Michael remembered my birthday and Mother's Day, and he even started inviting me to some of his work events, company picnics, and holiday parties where I could meet his employees and see what he'd built with the money I'd given him years earlier. But he still primarily contacted me when he needed something advice about personnel decisions, help understanding financial documents, or emotional support during stressful periods. Jennifer had improved the most significantly. She was genuinely interested in my life and made real effort to spend time with me, not because she needed something, but because she enjoyed my company. She'd started reading the same books as my book club so we could discuss them together. She came to some of my piano recitals. She even joined me for a few volunteer sessions at the Literacy Center. But the real test came when I got sick. It wasn't serious, just a bad bout of pneumonia that landed me in the hospital for a few days. But it was enough to scare them. More importantly, it was enough to reveal who they really were when I needed them instead of them needing me. Sarah flew in immediately, which I appreciated, but she spent most of her visit rearranging my medical care because she didn't trust my doctors. She took over conversations with nurses, demanded second opinions, and generally treated my illness like a business problem she needed to solve efficiently. She meant well, but she turned my hospital room into her temporary office, fielding work calls and answering emails while I was trying to rest. Michael visited once and brought me a plant, but he seemed uncomfortable in the hospital setting and left after 20 minutes. He called every day to check on me, which was sweet, but he always sounded relieved when I told him I was fine and recovering well. He wanted to help, but he didn't want to be inconvenienced. Jennifer surprised me. She took a week off work without me asking and moved into my house to take care of me when I came home from the hospital. She cooked my favorite foods, helped me with my medications, drove me to follow-up appointments, and just sat with me when I was too tired to talk. She didn't make it about her, didn't turn it into an opportunity to reorganize my life, didn't act like my illness was an inconvenience to her schedule. "Why are you doing this?" I asked her one evening as she brought me soup and settled in to watch old movies with me. "Because you're my mother and I love you," she said simply. "Because you took care of me when I was sick, and now it's my turn to take care of you. Your siblings love me too. I know they do, but they love you like a resource. I'm learning to love you like a person." That was when I knew Jennifer understood. After I recovered, I called Harold with one more change to the will. Instead of splitting the remaining 5% equally among all 3 children, I wanted to give it all to Jennifer. When Harold asked why, I told him she was the only one who'd learned the lesson I was trying to teach. But then I thought about it more. Was that really fair? Was I punishing Sarah and Michael for being who they were, or was I giving them a chance to learn and grow? Maybe they just needed more time. Maybe they needed a different kind of lesson. So I made a different decision. I decided not to change the will again, but to change something else instead. I decided to tell them about it while I was still alive. On Christmas Eve, 3 years after my forgotten birthday, I gathered all 3 of my children together at my house. Emma and Noah were there too, old enough now to understand what I was about to say. I prepared a speech, but when the moment came, I found myself speaking from the heart instead. I told them about my birthday 3 years ago. I told them about the cake I'd bought for myself, the phone calls that never came, the realization that I'd become invisible in their lives. I told them about the wine and the tears and the decision I'd made that night. I told them about the will. The silence in the room was deafening. Sarah's face went white, then red, then white again. Michael looked like he'd been punched in the stomach, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Jennifer started crying, not out of grief for the money she wouldn't inherit, but out of understanding for the pain I'd carried for 3 years. Then Sarah spoke first, her voice shaking with emotion. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. I mean, I knew I was busy, but I didn't realize how much I'd been neglecting you. I've been so focused on my career, on proving myself at work, that I forgot about the person who made it all possible." She went on to admit that she'd been taking me for granted in ways she was only now beginning to understand. She said she didn't care about the money, she cared about me, and she wanted to learn how to be a better daughter. The tears in her eyes seemed genuine, and for the first time in years, I felt like she was really seeing me. Michael was quiet for a long time, processing what I'd told them. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "I feel sick knowing how much I've hurt you, Mom. I've been so focused on building my business and providing for my own family that I forgot about the person who gave me the foundation to do all of that. You gave me my startup money, but more than that, you gave me my work ethic, my values, my understanding of what it means to sacrifice for the people you love." He asked what he could do to make it right, how he could prove that he understood what he'd almost lost. It was the first time in years that he'd asked me what I needed instead of telling me what he needed. Jennifer apologized for all the years of taking without giving, for treating me like a resource instead of a person, for nearly missing the chance to really know me. The past 3 years of getting to know you as Eleanor have been some of the best years of my life, she said. I almost missed out on having a real relationship with my own mother because I was too selfish to see past my own needs. I looked at my children, my grown, successful, complicated children, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt hope. Not hope that they would change overnight, not hope that they would suddenly become perfect, but hope that they understood, hope that they wanted to do better, hope that love could still be learned even by adults who thought they already knew everything. That night, after everyone had gone home, I called Harold one more time. I told him I wanted to change the will back to the original version, equal shares for all 3 children, with trust funds for the grandchildren and a smaller donation to charity. When he asked why, I told him that sometimes the threat of loss teaches better than the actual loss itself. My children didn't need to lose their inheritance to learn how to love me. They just needed to understand that it was possible to lose it. They needed to understand that relationships require effort, that love requires attention, that family isn't a given, it's a choice you make every day. 6 months later, Sarah called me on a random Tuesday just to ask how I was feeling. She'd been thinking about me, she said, and wanted to hear my voice. We talked for an hour about everything and nothing, books I was reading, problems at her work, memories from when she was young. For the first time in years, it felt like a real conversation between 2 people who cared about each other. Michael showed up at my house with homemade soup when he heard I had a cold. He'd learned to make it from a recipe I'd used when he was sick as a child, and he wanted to take care of me the way I'd taken care of him. We sat in my kitchen while I ate the soup, and he told me about his plans to expand his business, asking for my advice not because he needed it, but because he valued my opinion. Jennifer invited me to lunch and asked about my book club, my piano lessons, my thoughts on the novel we were reading. She'd started reading the same books so we could discuss them together, and she genuinely enjoyed our conversations about literature and life. She also asked about George, the man I'd been dating, and seemed genuinely happy that I was finding companionship and romance at my age. They remembered my 70th birthday with a celebration that lasted the entire weekend. Sarah took Friday off work to fly in early. Michael coordinated with his work crew to ensure he'd be completely available for family time. Jennifer planned activities that included my book club friends and George, recognizing that my life now extended beyond just our family unit. They remembered Mother's Day with thoughtful gifts that showed they'd actually been listening to me, a beautiful scarf from Sarah that matched a description I'd given of something I'd admired in Italy, a framed photo from Michael of the house he'd built with his first construction crew, a handwritten letter from Jennifer expressing her gratitude for everything I'd taught her about strength and independence. They remembered me not just on special occasions, but on ordinary days when remembering someone is the most meaningful gift of all. Sarah would text photos of sunsets from her business trips, remembering that I'd mentioned loving the way light changed throughout the day. Michael would call when he heard a song on the radio that reminded him of something from his childhood. Jennifer would invite me to Emma's school performances and Noah's soccer games, not because she needed a babysitter, but because she wanted to share their achievements with me. I never told them I'd change the will back. That wasn't the point. The point was that they'd learned something about love, about attention, about the difference between taking someone for granted and treating them like they matter. And I'd learned something too. I'd learned that it's never too late to teach, never too late to change, never too late to remember that you deserve to be loved as much as you love others. I'd learned that setting boundaries doesn't make you selfish, it makes you human. I'd learned that demanding respect doesn't make you difficult, it makes you worth respecting. My forgotten birthday had been the worst day of my life, but it had also been the beginning of the best years of my life. Sometimes you have to lose yourself completely before you can find yourself again. Sometimes you have to be forgotten before you can be truly remembered. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, the people who forgot you will learn how to remember not just your birthday, but who you really are. I'm 71 now, and my children call me regularly. Not because they need something, but because they want to hear my voice. They visit not because they feel obligated, but because they enjoy my company. They remember my birthday not because it's marked on a calendar, but because they can't imagine forgetting the day that brought me into their world. Sarah has started taking vacations not just for work, but for pleasure, and she often invites me to join her for weekend trips. Michael brings his children by the house regularly, teaching them the same values about family and hard work that I taught him. Jennifer and I have become genuine friends, 2 women who happen to be related, but who choose to spend time together because we enjoy each other's company. It took 70 years for me to learn that love isn't just about giving. It's about teaching people how to give back. It's about showing people that you're worth remembering, worth calling, worth loving. It's about understanding that unconditional love doesn't mean accepting unconditional neglect. And sometimes, if you're brave enough to risk everything, you might just get everything you've always wanted in return. The day I updated my will was the day I started updating my life. The day I stopped being invisible was the day I became truly seen. The day I chose myself was the day my children learned to choose me too. Some lessons take a lifetime to learn. Some love takes a lifetime to understand. Some families take a lifetime to become real. But it's never too late to start.